the reason that I know how Putin came to power and the reason that I know what our role was, our broadly meaning us, Western democratic societies, is that the Russian opposition explained it to me. So they followed this for many years. That they would say, well, you people, you talk about human rights. Why do you let Russian oligarchs hide their money in London? Why do you let them buy property using anonymous companies and shell companies? Why have you created these tax havens that they can steal money from the Russian state and hide it there? We were absolutely responsible for that, and we've been responsible for the rise of kleptocracy elsewhere as well.
We live in a multipolar world. We live in a world where power, whether it's economic, political, cultural, is seeping away from the United States and moving elsewhere. Where is it going? Primarily China, Southeast Asia, Russia, other parts of the world too. And today's guest has some issues with that. They're particularly concerned about the rise of an autocratic international, as they call it, Autocracy Inc. That's a set of countries which are intent on crafting a different kind of global order, and all while trying to undermine democratic values and norms, but, perhaps ironically, using a global financial architecture built by the West. They embezzle money and enrich themselves using the apparatus, the assets, the processes, the institutions of places just like the United Kingdom. Now, you know my views on multipolarity. I think it's generally a good thing. Of course, not everyone agrees. So that's why we're having this conversation. Anne Applebaum, welcome to Downstream.
Thanks for having me.
I think you are the first winner of the Pulitzer Prize to join us. I think we've had Francis Fukuyama.
He's won some prizes.
I don't think he's not won a Nobel. I don't know. Of course he's not.
No.
That's
I'm sure he's
away.
won more prizes than me.
Pulitzer's a pretty big deal. We are talking today about your new book, Autocracy Inc, The Dictators Who Want to Run the World. It looks bigger than it is. It's only 176 pages, I think. A real intervention into ongoing contemporary political debates. Very quickly, let's start with the basics. What is Autocracy Inc?
So the book describes a network of dictatorships it's a narrow group. It does not include all dictatorships, but it includes a particular group who are not bound by ideology. They don't share a single idea, and that makes them different from alliances of the past. So we're talking about communist China, nationalist Russia, theocratic Iran, Bolivarian socialist Venezuela, a handful of others, North Korea, and others, who have begun to cooperate where it suits them, transactionally, and at the moments when it's in their interests, and they share surveillance technology, they share common tactics of repression against dissidents. The state or quasi-state companies of one country invest in the state or quasi-state companies of another, and they've also begun to support one another to keep one another in power. The one thing that unifies them is their dislike of us, and by us I mean you and me, and probably most of the people listening to your program. People who believe in, it's not even about democracy, it's about liberal society, checks and balances, transparency, the rule of law, because those ideas threaten their particular form of power. And also those ideas are often the ideas that are used by their opposition movements. So that whether it's the Iranian women's movement, or whether it's the Hong Kong democratic movement, or whether it's the Navalny movement in Russia, those are the ideas that they espouse. And so they have begun to push back against these ideas wherever they are, inside their own countries and around the world. And the book just describes that group, how it came to be, what role the American and European and the democratic world more broadly played in creating it, and some initial early thoughts about how to fight back.
On Putin's anti-liberalism in particular, I mean, that is a very sort of incontrovertible, quite conspicuous part of his politics. But it wasn't always thus. In the early 21st century, he was viewed as effectively a liberal helmsman for post-Yeltsin, post-transition Russia.
Right.
So,
so I never thought that.
I know you didn't think. Well, that's the question. So how deep does the anti-liberalism for somebody like Putin go? Because I would look at Putin as really a reactionary political figure in so much as he believes in pre-liberal political ideas. You're just saying it's actually about expediency and self-interest. And if tomorrow he needs to say something else to maximize his interests, he would.
I think, people can have more than one idea or more than one motivation. I think Putin is motivated simultaneously by some weird mystical thing about recreating the Russian Empire. I think that's true. I think he's very profoundly motivated by the desire to stay in power indefinitely. I think he's motivated by the desire to keep his money wherever it is and for the people around him to keep their money. And I think he's motivated by profound resentment of the democratic world that robbed him of his career as a KGB officer. So, all those things add up. I do think that from the 90s, he was somebody who never accepted or believed in certainly liberal politics. He went along for a long time with the idea that Russia could trade with the West and that would be okay and there could be some degree of integration. But really, from the moment he had power in Russia, the very, very first things he did was begin to shut down the media, recontrol civil society, create fake political parties, and so on. He had an illiberal agenda from the early 2000s. It's just that we chose not to notice it.
So the counter argument with Putin is that he is a reflection of a Russian political class, which is effectively anti-liberal or has an aversion to political social liberalism. You look at the other parties in the Russian Duma. That's quite obvious. So what do you make of that argument where people say that actually Putin is an expression of something more profound? There are people worse than him in Russian politics. It's not a defense of Putin, but there are people that are even more reactionary than he is. Whereas you would say he's a sort of, or I presume you would sort of say, he's the sort of typical archetypal autocrat dictator that we see from the 20th century. A strongman.
No, I don't think he's the 20th century strongman. I think he's different, actually. I think the 21st century is different. I think the money makes it different, the way they behave, the access they have to international finance. I think the 21st century autocrats are a little different. Again, I think I'm not sure I'm going to disagree with you. He represents a class of people who are all very wealthy and seek to maintain their power. They have convinced a large part of the Russian population to stay out of politics. So he doesn't have significant dissent in the old way that we would think of it. Although I would, remember that there is no such thing as a public square in Russia or open debate. So we don't really know what people think. People don't have political ideas that they share and so on. So that's different. And then I think at the same time, he represents his group of not all of them, but very often ex-KGB people who were young when the Soviet Union broke up, and he also has some of his own interests as well.
Are we partly to blame for Putin in
Absolutely, we're partly to blame.
Okay, go on.
That's one. There's a chapter in the book about how we're to blame for Putin. Yeah, no, I think the enable. It's funny. And the reason, by the way, the reason that I know how Putin came to power and the reason that I know what our role was, our broadly meaning us Western democratic societies, is that the Russian opposition explained it to me. So they followed this for many years. That they would say, well, you people, you talk about human rights. Why do you let Russian oligarchs hide their money in London? Why do you let them buy property using anonymous companies and shell companies? Why have you created these tax havens that they can steal money from the Russian state and hide it there? Putin's career begins in the 90s. And this is a very famous story. It's been told by multiple people. And there's sort of 3 or 4 books about Putin that explain this. One very good one by British journalist Catherine Belton, but others by Masha Gessen and others, that describe how as early as the early 90s, Putin, in his role as deputy mayor of St. Petersburg, was already involved in essentially, I mean, I'm simplifying a bit, but essentially taking money from the Russian state, taking it out of the country, laundering it abroad, keeping some of it abroad and bringing some of it back and then using it to buy property and make investments and so on. So he was very interested in becoming rich from very early. And he was typical of a whole class of people who were doing that. And when you look at his personal history, when you look at some of the business deals that he was involved in, to the extent that we know about it, we of course don't know about everything, he very often had Western partners. You know, there was a Luxembourg partner, there have been several German partners, there were certainly lawyers and accountants who helped him in this project, and people like him. I mean, he's part of a class. And we enabled this, essentially theft, you know, and money laundering, and we enabled the rise of the oligarchy that became the Russian state, and now is essentially this one. It's not really a one-man show. That's the wrong way to put it. It's a hierarchy. It's a kind of spider web, and he managed to end up at the middle of it. But no, we were absolutely responsible for that, and we've been responsible for the rise of kleptocracy elsewhere as well. So I don't. It wouldn't have been possible without, Deutsche Bank and a whole series of financial institutions and enablers.
It's also recent as well. I mean, obviously you have the World Cup in Russia in 2018, which is just insane now to think about it. It's 4 years after Crimea. And I remember a flurry of stories in the early 2010s. You would regularly read about killings of Russians with tier 1 visas in London, and nobody really talked about it very much. It wasn't like a thing, but now on reflection, it was actually quite a significant moment.
There used to be this phrase in U.S. politics, the soft bigotry of low expectations. It was this, we thought so little of the Russians that when they killed each other in London, it was kind of like, oh, that's just what Russians do.
Yeah.
But actually, I mean, there were people committing crimes on British soil. These were actual murders. In one case, famously, they brought radioactive poison into the country and left traces of it all over Mayfair. And we still didn't take it seriously enough. I mean, we saw these as weird one-off stories and not something that was deeper and more, more symptomatic. I mean, this was already a decade ago, more really. It was already a regime that was scornful of our laws and even the idea of the rule of law, and was already seeking to undermine it. The point was to show we don't care about your laws and your rules. We can do whatever we want. And in my view, and this is not just a Russian thing. I mean, this is a class of dictators who can do whatever they want inside their own countries. And increasingly they want to show, and we can do whatever we want anywhere else. And and in order to do that, they need to show that the slogans that we use and the institutions that we've created, and even some of the institutions we've jointly created, like the United Nations. I mean, the UN Charter says you can't invade sovereign countries. You can't change borders by force. And the Russians signed up to the UN Charter, and so did everybody else. But increasingly, they seek to show that those don't apply to them and that sovereignty means they get to do whatever they want.
I suppose a left wing, so you've talked about our partial culpability with the rise of Putin, a sort of left wing, sympathetic to Russia, not Putin, sort of standpoint would be, that's all true, totally agree. We've ended up in the same place with regards to tax havens, tax evasion, fantastic, oligarchs. However, what about the transition of the early 1990s, where we saw median life expectancy for the average, not just Russian, Ukrainian, Belarusian, across that part of the world, fall, lots of excess deaths, although we don't quite know how many. That famous Lancet study puts it at, I think, 5 or 6 million. I mean, but again, you can only ever speculate about that stuff. The point is that the nature of the transition necessarily, somebody on the left might say, necessarily led to oligarchs. And actually, there was a momentous historical opportunity to integrate Russia into the broader European architecture, militarily, economically, and we completely screwed it up. I mean, what do you make of that argument?
So, I was there for a lot of this time, and I watched this process happening. And first of all, remember that there was a similar kinds of transitions happening in Poland, in the Czech Republic, elsewhere. In the Baltic states, and those transitions we now consider to have been successful. So The problem wasn't the idea of transition. The problem was who carried it out and with what motivations. And one of the things that happened in the post-Soviet world, with the partial exception of the Baltic states, although there was some, there's a lot of financial crime in some of them as well. You immediately had the process hijacked. I mean, in essence, and this is not my reporting, this is many other people. In essence, the Russian security state was preparing for that transition as early as the 80s. It was already beginning to.
Can you put a year on that? Because that's really interesting. Like the early 80s, the mid 80s, or
mid 80s, mid to late 80s. I mean, really, as soon as Gorbachev appears, right. You have maybe even earlier than that. I mean, I couldn't give you a precise date, but they are already beginning to think about. They're already setting up shell companies. Some of it, by the way, was to do with organizing payments for terrorism. I mean, there was a department in the KGB that did money laundering. I mean, essentially, they were funding terrorist movements around the world and so on. And there were people who knew about money, and they already begin setting up companies in the late 80s, and they already begin thinking about how they're going to. What's going to happen afterwards. And there's an argument that says, we tend to look at the world as if we were at the center of it. So we look at the Russian transition, and I'm as guilty of this as anybody else at the time. We looked at it as, how did we fail? These were our ideas, and somehow they went wrong. And we told the story of the Russian transition as if it was a kind of a story of failed democracy. Like they were trying to get to democracy, but they didn't make it. And we told it as in that frame. What if that's not what happened? Maybe what happened was a very clever, well-prepared group of former KGB and former Communist Party, and in some cases former Komsomol people, in very well-prepared, methodically took over the Russian state and made it into what it is. And the story is their march to power, not the Harvard economists or whoever it was who you think were trying to run things in the 1990s. It was actually about the takeover of the state that was happening while we were paying attention to other things. That's actually what I now think happened. I think there were a lot of nuances. There was Yeltsin, I think, was a well-meaning president who did hope to be a different kind of Russia. I knew many Russians, I worked with a lot of them, who wanted a different kind of Russia. There were many people who believed that the integration with the West would be good for Russia, and they wanted what we wanted. They hoped that economic integration would bring political integration and that, would bring democracy. I mean, there were people who worked for that. But I think they weren't the main story. I think the main story was this business story. Business is the wrong word for it, but the main story was the takeover of the institutions by it's hard to say. It wasn't necessarily leaders of the former regime. It was people who were thinking about how they were going to make money in this new situation.
Because I suppose, again, coming at it from the left, you could look at Russia and say, missed opportunity. It could have looked more like the transition of the DDR. Right, so you have...
Yeah, but the transition of the DDR had the benefit of this massive subsidy from West Germany.
Of course.
And you could, not everybody in the DDR was all that happy either. I mean, I think the most successful transition, maybe I would say this because I lived there part of the time, but if you look at Poland, you look at the Baltic states...
Poland's...
You look at the Czech Republic, those were countries where you had motivated political class whose dream was what they would have described at the time. They would say, we want to be normal. And what normal meant was integrated with Europe, social market economy, European Union, NATO. They wanted to be like everybody else they knew who lived in Western Europe. And that was their goal. And the Russians did not have that as a goal. And actually, initially, the Ukrainians didn't either.
What's the secret sauce for Poland? Because I went there the first time a couple of years ago, and I was shocked at the development and wealth, particularly of major cities in the west of Poland. I mean, that's always been comparatively wealthier. But compared to medium-sized cities in this country, places like Wrocław are really doing well. And I don't think Brits realise that. So, what's the secret sauce there?
Well, first, just to be clear to your listeners, my husband is a Polish politician, so take everything I say with a grain of salt. I have, lived there on and off for 30 years. But I think part of it is that the Poles, in the way that the younger echelons of the KGB were preparing for the transition, by preparing to steal a lot of money, there was a cohort of people in Poland also in the 80s who were preparing to think differently about Poland. I mean, they actually had some of the economists who wound up leading the transition were already writing papers about how to do it in the 80s. There was a cohort of politicians who had some legitimacy, who'd been opposition leaders for a long time. So there was a group of people who in the 90s had as I said, they had this very clear idea and a kind of clear direction of where to go. And then I think a lot of Poland's success has also been from the EU. I mean, first NATO membership, which gave investors the idea that this is a stable country. Then EU membership, which meant you could invest in Poland as if it were Germany or France, and you'd had some reassurance that EU law would protect you. I mean, I think that brought in investment, but it also gave Poles confidence. So there's, this Poland is also, I think, just big enough. So Poland has its own entrepreneurs and its own companies. We know people who have had no money 30 years ago, but who have made money by doing something in Poland. And so there was a strong enough economy, and that sort of lifted. It didn't lift everybody, but I mean, almost you could say I don't think there's anybody in Poland now who's worse off certain than their grandparents and probably their parents. I mean, you've had a national gain in wealth that's been pretty universal.
Yeah. I mean, there's some nostalgia for the past in Poland, like any country.
Well, nostalgia, it's a different subject. I mean, subject of my previous book, in fact. Nostalgia is something that you get in almost anywhere where you have very rapid change. This is a conclusion I came to because I tried to understand nostalgia in Britain, nostalgia in Poland, nostalgia in the United States, and very different countries, completely different histories. And you had the very similar forms of nostalgia for some imagined traditional past and so on. And the more I read about it and talk to people, and the more I think it's really any time in history when you have very, very rapid change of any change for the good, change for the bad. When you have and think what we've had in the last 2 or 3 decades, the social changes, demographic change, economic change, the change in the nature of information, the way in which we understand the world is completely different now even than it was 10 years ago. You have people for whom the cacophony, and the speed are too much. And nostalgia is a kind of natural reaction. I mean, there are different versions of it. There's the British nostalgia for the countryside. There's a Polish nostalgia, for the small town that I grew up in, where everybody went to church on Sunday and everyone knew everyone else, and it was a real community. And people who have that nostalgia and who think that community is lost are not wrong. Like that town that you grew up in, where everybody went to church and knew everybody else, is probably gone, or it's different, or people have left and moved to Warsaw, or they've moved to London, or the factory that everyone worked at, broke up, and now there are these little, small workshops that don't build the same kind of community. I mean, there has been real change, and so they're not wrong. There has been real change, and it seems to me that it's the job of whatever you want to call them, centrist, liberal, center-left, democratic politicians, to find a way of giving people like that a sense of stability and of a future. Because when you have rapid change, you have, I think, a feeling of loss. I mean, if you look at the 19th century, if you look at the Industrial Revolution, you get the same kind of thing.
I mean, when I was in Poland a couple of years ago, it was interesting talking to people on the left, like Razem and so on, and I'm coming from the UK, where we've had 15 years of, frankly, decline, inertia, stagnation. And I'm like, you have a profoundly different political set of circumstances here. Like, let's be objectively fair. You've never had it so good. Whereas in Britain, there's a very visceral decline. Back to the book. You write this sentence, actually, it's quite gripping. It's right at the end. And I'm thinking, why is it not at the beginning? You explicitly say, quote, "There is no liberal world order anymore." It's quite a striking thing to say. When did that happen?
I mean, you could argue there never was. I mean, it's always been a partial fiction. Not fiction is the wrong word. It's been an aspiration. The idea that there was some kind of world order and there was a set of international laws that we all obeyed and there were international institutions that had some power. I mean, that's been more true at some times than others. And of course, it's one of the things that's always sort of honored in the breach. I mean, people notice it when it's being violated. I mean, there is a UN convention on genocide, and that didn't stop the genocide in Rwanda, did it? And there are UN and other international laws against torture, and that didn't stop either the Vietnamese torturing Americans, nor did it stop Americans torturing Iraqis. So it's always been a little aspirational. I think the change of the last several years, probably in the last decade, has been the more concerted attempt, starting with the Chinese actually, but now the Russians and the Iranians and others, to not just to kind of hedge it or ignore it, but really to undermine those institutions and those rules. And so, the Chinese have a specific policy in the UN to quash conversations about human rights. They don't want anyone to talk about the Uyghurs anywhere in any UN building, and they will try and disrupt it if anybody does. And, they don't want there to be any international, formal or informal inquiries into anything that they do. And they are actually trying to remove the language of human rights from international documents and replace it. There's other phrases they like to use, and one of them is win-win cooperation, which, who's against that? Nobody. Win-win cooperation means, what they mean it to mean is that you don't criticize us and we don't criticize you. So you don't notice, whatever we've done, and we, and we all just do business, and that's it. And that's and they would prefer that. They want to talk about that and not human rights. So they also use the word sovereignty in a particular way. And sovereignty means, again, we get to decide how we rule our country, and nobody else gets to have anything to say about it. And then, as I said, increasingly that means, to Putin has taken another step further. Sovereignty means I get to invade who I want, and you can't stop me. And there's no rule that says I can't control my neighbors because I have sovereignty and Ukraine doesn't. I mean, he's almost said more or less that.
What do you think Putin wants in Ukraine?
Oh, he wants to occupy Ukraine, destroy it as a country, root out the idea of Ukrainianness. Maybe, I mean, you can look at what he's done on occupied Ukrainian territory. They set up concentration camps, they do mass arrests, they kidnap children, they deport them to Russia, they change their identities, they erase the use of the Ukrainian language, they destroy Ukrainian books, they remove Ukrainian history from schools and universities. I mean, the word genocide is now so overused that I'm even hesitant to use it. But I mean, this is their goal. It's the erasure of Ukraine as a nation, and that's always been his goal, I think.
I mean, but that sort of going back to my point a few moments ago. I mean, that gets to the point, which is looking at this purely as, and I agree that many of these relationships, Venezuela, Iran, Russia, clearly quite transactional. But then it does seem to me that Putin, February 2022, made a calculated choice, which is I'm perfectly happy for Russia to be a poorer country, less integrated with the world economy, because of this ideological desire.
No, I'm not saying they have no ideology. I'm saying they don't share an ideology.
Yeah.
I mean, the Iranians have an ideology.
Yeah.
The ideology of Islamic Jihad is very, very real,
and
they believe it.
Do you think the Iranians are jihadists, the Islamic Republic of Iran?
Well, jihad, sorry, that's probably the wrong word in this context. But I mean, what they believe. I mean, they believe that they're a theocracy. They believe in spreading it. They believe that as many nations as possible should be subject to similar kind of law. I mean, it's a revolutionary Islamic state. Jihad is the wrong word. Sorry.
No, it's fine. I'm half Iranian, so I'm quite on top of the on the language. But yeah, I mean, I think lots of people maybe watching this don't know that it's a Shia country, not Sunni, etc.
Right.
Yeah, that to me is probable, and there's something I certainly missed on the left because and again, there's parts that I actually agree with lots of the prognosis, but I disagree with some of the diagnosis because I am a quote unquote realist, which I mean you're at odds at, and
I'm a realist.
Yeah, but so we'll talk about this more, but the title of the book is, and it's really worth reading. Dictators who want to run the world, Autocracy Inc. And I would sort of translate it as almost, here's why sanctions no longer work against Russia, Iran, Venezuela, why decoupling won't work with China. Like this old paradigm won't work. That's how I would almost rename it, because
I'd say that's a narrow interpretation.
Because they've created an alternative globalization which they want to make alluring to the global south. And that does seem like a really existential challenge to the West.
No, I think you're right. That's one of the things they're doing. They're doing it as a reaction to us because they see as I said, they see the language and values and ideas that we use, sometimes thoughtlessly and not very seriously, but they see them as a threat. And so they're trying to create a world in which those ideas don't apply. And so what bothers them? Human rights bothers them a lot. The rule of law bothers them a lot. Transparency bothers them a lot. Accountability. The ideas of, constitutional law, and freedom of speech. All those things bother them a lot. And so they would like to create a world in which those things aren't part of international institutions and agreements, which they are now and have been since the Second World War, and in which they don't apply. And so they are, that's the alternate global view. That's what they mean when they talk about multi-polarity, which is a strange word that has different meanings. That's what they mean when they talk about, that's what they would like the global South to be part of. I don't think the global South necessarily wants to be part of that. And also I hate the expression global South, but...
Well, it's the word now, isn't it? I mean, it's underdeveloped or developing world, It's...
Yeah, but I mean, it lumps like South Africa and Ecuador and with Zimbabwe. I mean, those are such different places, but...
Yeah. I suppose sticking to that word of multipolarity, this is what I mean when I say I'm a realist. So I would look at multipolarity and just say, well, look, this is a geopolitical fact. You're seeing economic and political power seep away, and America probably still will remain the world's hegemon for this century, but you can still be the hegemon and power seep away from you, and it's seeping towards not just China, India, but ASEAN, all sorts of places, West Asia, etc. And I would look at that as just a simple geopolitical fact, whereas it seems to me in the book, there's a project which says, well, actually, that doesn't have to happen.
So let me parse that a little bit. So the word multipolarity can mean what you just said it means. It means that lots of other countries have power, and that is objectively true. And you can use the word that way. I mean, I have a quote in the book actually from, I think, one of the UN Secretary General saying something about we live in a multipolar world.
Yeah.
Of course we do. That's kind of indisputable. When the Russians and the Venezuelans and others who are part of this particular use it, they mean something different. They mean, as I said, it's a world in which our rules apply and those old rules don't. So what they're interested in is a world where the idea of human rights is a Western, imperialist term, and in our nations with our traditional cultures, we don't have rights, and that's what they want to establish. And so, so they're trying to establish a kind of alternate way of speaking about the world. And they say this periodically. So it's, I can't quote off the top of my head, but in the book, I have quotes from Putin, from Xi, and others more or less saying that, this is an alternate view of the world. But that's what they mean. They mean it's a world without rights. It's a world without the rule of law. It's a world where might makes right, and the biggest countries get to invade little ones. And that's what they're trying to establish. Putin's. I actually think the Putin's invasion of Ukraine, which began, of course, in 2014 and continued in 2022, was his way, what he intended it to be, partly. You asked before what it was. Partly it's the destruction of Ukraine, but he also intended it as a way of saying, I don't care about your rules. I don't care about the UN Charter, which says, countries have the right to sovereignty. I don't care about your human rights. I don't care about this idea of never again, this European mantra that after the war we'll never have mass murder in Europe again. I don't care about any of that. I'm going to do it, and I'm going to show you I don't care about it. And what he thought was that nobody would respond, that because he believed, as the Russian dissident said to me 20 years ago, that we talk a lot about human rights, but we don't back it up. And that he was going to be able to do what he wants. So that was an attempt to establish his version of multipolarity, which is I get to say what the rules are.
Going back to that realist point, I suppose, and it was a blind spot for me as somebody on the left, as a quote-unquote realist, I simply didn't think that Putin would invade a country like that in a very, not even a 20th century fashion, a 19th century
fashion. But he did it already in 2014.
I know, but it was just so out, GDP, it's by PPP, very large economy, like maybe fifth largest economy in the world by PPP at the time. Just so integrated, oil exports to Europe. It just struck me as so utterly insane. And actually, sometimes it's important for people on the left to say, you know what, we got that quite badly wrong. I simply didn't think it. What I thought would happen is there'll just be this permanent grey zone conflict in eastern Ukraine. They'll nibble. They'll keep on changing the regime in Kyiv until they get the guy they like. Do you know what I mean? That's what I thought. Quasi-quiet state.
To be fair, that's what they wanted.
Right.
I mean, that was the original idea.
Yeah, that was the plan. The little green men, yeah.
Little green men also influencing Ukraine in different ways, through propaganda, through money, through influence, through political games. I mean, that was their game for a long time. They wanted to control Ukraine, so that was the idea. But see, it seems to me that and this was not a left-wing problem. This was a whole society, all political spectrum problem, is that all of us have accepted our own logic. So in our minds, the point of government is to create prosperity, right? And to make our country wealthier, and government should be about enriching people, maybe not even just financially, but in many ways. And in Putin's mind, that is not the point of government. And that's why he was so hard to understand. In his mind, the point of government is his personal glory. As I said, I've said this already, protecting his money, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that's what he has in common, for example, with Xi. Xi's a little different because I think he thinks his power also and his glory depend on China being a rich country and eventually being the richest country. But does he care about, the individual fate of particular people? No, he does not. Nor does Putin, nor do the leaders of Iran. That's not what they are. That's not the purpose of government. And all of us think, I have a funny memory of, I can't remember now which UK election it was, where I noticed that there was some kind of back and forth dispute about whether taxes were going to be 1% or 2% higher. There's some angry, I can't remember, Ed Miliband, David Cameron. It's lost in a fog.
They all look the same.
No, but I remember thinking, what a lucky country, in which that's what politics is the tax rate going to go up 1% or 2% because everybody assumes that the point of government is well-being, and we're arguing about the size of the budget and the size of the welfare state, but that's not the point of government for many autocrats, as I said. And so it's hard for us to see their point of view because it's so alien to ours, whether we're left-wing or right-wing.
One of the key parts of the book is this idea that this, you call it Autocracy Inc, but let's call it Autocratic International. There's counter-globalization sort of movement. One of the things they do is misinformation, and I think that's obviously undeniable with regards to someone like Russia. I'm a bit more sympathetic to the Chinese argument than you are, I think. Sympathetic is not the right word. I just don't think they're in a league with Russia. But reading this, obviously, there's a case that disagrees with that. But the misinformation argument also has some interesting counter-arguments. It was in the FT Weekend. You wrote an article for the supplement, the cover story over the weekend. In the FT magazine, I don't know if it was a response to you or if it just happens to be a coincidence, there was an article saying that actually the obsession with misinformation in Western democratic states is more dangerous to democracy than the idea of misinformation. And it was a study that pulled up the fact that I think 6% of news sites in the US election in 2016 that people were using en masse were misinformation websites. And then when you ask the average American, they say they don't trust 65% of the news they get. So there's this big asymmetry between actually how much misinformation is out there. There's a lot, you can't dismiss it. But actually, by talking about misinformation so incessantly, we build in a cynicism and nihilism into even the possibility of a meaningful public sphere. What do you make of that argument?
So that's a fair argument. Stipulate, I did not read the article, and I didn't think it was a response to me.
I doubt it would have been.
My article was about kleptocracy, but
it was really nicely timed, though.
I didn't manage to read it. I'll now rush home and do it, though. So, a couple of things. I mean, one is that remember that there are actors in all of our countries, actually, but certainly in the United States, some very powerful ones who are actively and openly trying to convince people that they're being lied to. So this was actually Trump's, even before Donald Trump was a political candidate, when he was still a tabloid guy in New York, he understood the power of undermining so-called mainstream media. Even this expression, mainstream media, was invented by people who didn't want you to read or trust mainstream media. So the idea of building mistrust, convincing people not to trust anything, whether it's the BBC or whether it's the or whether it's the NHS, building in mistrust is a deliberate political tactic, and it's been around. So I'm not sure that you can blame the sense that we're being lied to on people who've studied misinformation, which is 17 academics and 5 journalists at in a few different places. I would say that the rise of mistrust has a much deeper and more, it's been much more deliberate. Mistrust has been deliberately cultivated by people who have political goals. So I don't think you're wrong that there's very high levels of mistrust, but I'm not sure that the reason is that people talk about misinformation.
Yeah, okay. We'll park that. It's an interesting conversation. I suppose building on that, there's an argument to say that, and by the way, I'm a huge fan of the BBC. BBC Radio 4, I love it.
Me too.
It's very good. It's very good. I think BBC Radio 4 is in a different league to BBC TV. But there is an argument that people are right to mistrust parts of the media if you look at recent experiences. So, of course, the Iraq War is one example. But a more recent example in this country is that after 2010, all the major political parties and the media bought into this idea of austerity, right? And on reflection now, 14 years later, the entire political class is going, that's kind of a mistake, actually. We overcooked it. And I think lots of people would reflect on the media demonizing people on, for instance, welfare, rather than having a technical, sensible conversation about deficits and saying, well, actually, they screwed up and we're paying the price as a country.
Surely there's a difference between kind of groupthink and people making the wrong analysis of the economy. Yeah. This is why my dislike is not of the BBC. My dislike is of economics. Because economics purports to be a science that can predict the future and that gives economy. But of course it's not. And so there was a misanalysis. It wasn't misinformation. It was a wrong analysis. Or it can be. It could have been a wrong analysis. And there's a difference between that and people who deliberately scam viewers and create false stories or false narratives and repeatedly try to, pump them into the ether. That doesn't seem to me comparable problems. You can say the political class got this or that analysis wrong, or they made this or that wrong decision, and people were wrong to support it. You could look back at many points in history and say that maybe World War I was a mistake.
Sure.
You could find, but that's different from the combination. Some of them are political opportunists, and some of them are just grifters because you can make money on misinformation. So there's a difference between that and the people who deliberately create misinformation to fool people.
I think that's true, but I think certainly in my lifetime, more people are attuned to this idea, and you put it perfectly, of groupthink within the media. And it's particularly problematic in this country because at least in the US, you've got the LA people, the New York people, the Texas people, the Chicago people. In this country, everybody's in London. And so I do think the British media and political class is almost uniquely disposed to groupthink, actually. And we saw that with Brexit, right? There was very little recognition of actually how likely it was. If you looked at the polling, it was highly plausible, actually. If you really
predicted it.
Well, there you go. No, but okay, but you're a political scientist. And here's where it gets interesting because, in most professions, if you're right when everyone else is wrong, great job. Whereas in journalism, all the incentives work against you breaking with the herd, but you don't stick your head up because if you do, you get shot at. I genuinely think that undermines confidence in the media because so many mistakes in the media, and like I said, it's not malevolence, it's not misinformation, it's groupthink. And I think groupthink in the last 25, 30 years has really, really screwed the media.
Maybe, although it's funny. I've worked in British media as well as U.S. media, and British media historically has been so the Guardian versus the Telegraph versus you've had quite a lot of divisions. It's not like there's no variety or no diversity or no range of views available to people in Britain. It's not like it's a uniform society.
Well,
I'm just thinking about. U.S. is bigger. It's true, and so we have we have in that sense more variety. But by the standards of, I was about to say small countries, but you're not a small country.
No,
we are not a small country.
We are.
No.
California's got a bigger GDP. It's fine.
No, medium-sized countries. I mean, the UK has a pretty rambunctious. I mean, by comparison, I don't know, media in the Czech Republic which is much smaller, of course. Is much. I mean, Britain has a really developed media culture and lots of different kinds of media organizations, including this one. So it's I would say it's by the standards of medium-sized countries in the world, not that bad. But that's my distance perspective.
Elon Musk, what should happen to him? He's saying some pretty extraordinary things on Twitter. So should we shut down Twitter? Should he lose his US citizenship? What's the...
No, I don't think he should lose his U.S. citizenship. I mean, this is maybe a longer conversation for another podcast. But my view is that we should regulate social media, by which I do not mean we should censor it. I think we should give people control of their data. It should be, and this is technologically, this is possible. You should give people control over the algorithms that are used so that they have some say in what it is that they're seeing, at the very least. I think there should be more, it may have to involve government, it may have to involve other kinds of efforts, but there should be a lot more creative thinking about how to have online political conversations in a way that's compatible with democracy. Having rich guys decide what you see, and having, having algorithms designed essentially to make you angry and create political division, I don't think in the long term is compatible with a society in which we've always had rules there are rules of conversation, whether we acknowledge them or not, right? There's rules in a television studio, there are parliamentary rules of debate. We've established rules that let people talk, that give people, that are designed to create and encourage balanced conversation. Those aren't the rules that exist on social media or the internet or more broadly. And we should begin to think more creatively about how to bring those in. And that would be that's rather than, we might like the idea of locking Elon Musk up in a, jail cell on a small desert island, but it doesn't seem to me like that's going to solve the problem. So I wouldn't be in favor of it.
Well, I put that to you because, you've had the Telegram founder, that's happened to him.
Yeah, although that is not, as I understand it, that's not about content moderation. That's not because he's promoting some particular ideas. That's because his Telegram has refused to cooperate with French police on 2 or 3 things, but mostly it's child pornography and it's terrorism recruitment. Yeah, and he simply hasn't. They don't respond and they don't cooperate. And when they're asked by the police, where they're told that there's evidence, they don't interact. And so that puts them more in the position, really, of a bank, for example, that tolerates the funding of terrorist groups or that tolerates money laundering. So it's not even a speech issue. It's not about right to speech. No. It's about crime, and it may actually be. And this I don't know. I'm not saying something I know. I'm just guessing. I mean, it may be that because Twitter has reduced the trust and safety part of the team so much that Twitter also runs into problems eventually on those same kinds of issues. I don't know, but it's my basic argument about the online world is that it should abide by the same laws as the offline world. I mean, if people were creating child pornography, across the street from here, we would want to stop them, right? So what's the difference between that and people doing it somewhere on the internet? It should be the same law. And that's something I think maybe some governments are finally beginning to grasp or get their minds around. Yeah,
I feel like we're hitting an inflection point. I mean, there's also the Brazil Musk story where, nation states are beginning to get the confidence to say, actually, you know what, you don't operate here. We don't want to see that stuff here. Final question, Israel. Now, it's talks about, it's sort of hinted at in the book, and obviously I think this was primarily written in maybe the months just immediately following October 7th or just before it.
It was written. It was 90% of the book was written before.
October 7th. You can. Yeah. It's and again, it's important to say it's a polemic, a manifesto. So you're sort of trying to gesture at things, and that's just the nature of a good polemic. I hope you don't mind me saying it's a polemic, but that's how it comes across. Okay. Yeah. So my worry with Israel is that it's not an autocracy, but I worry it's the future of democracy. And that's because of all the things you've talked about, actually. It doesn't really believe in a rules-based international order. Look at things like the ICC, the ICJ. It believes in might makes right. If you look at its domestic political scene, partly as a result of demographics, it's moving right. One might argue in the long term, again, if you look at demographics, it's becoming more religious. In a way, it's moving away from liberal modernity. And people talk about Zionists as this big thing. Well, there's all kinds of Zionists. You've got the Labour Zionists from the 60s and 70s. People like Ben Gvir, Smotrich are very, very different. They're very different. So what do you make of that argument? Firstly, that actually a country like Israel might not be an autocracy, but in some ways it's more concerning for democracies if that's our future.
So what you have just said is exactly the argument of the Israeli democracy movement and of the Israeli left. I mean, this is exactly their fear. I mean, if you remember last summer before October the 7th, a year ago, Israel was convulsed by these weekly demonstrations, huge, different kinds of demonstrations. Actually, some of them were on the street, some of them were around Netanyahu's house, and they were all, and the argument is that Israel is at risk of becoming a dictatorship, that the government is not abiding by the rule of law, that it was trying to change the judicial system to politicize it, make judges more easier to manipulate. I mean, which, by the way, is a pattern of democratic decline that we saw in Hungary, we saw in Poland, although in Poland it was reversed. We saw in Venezuela. Actually, it's not even that different from what Hugo Chavez did. This is not a left or a right wing thing. And the argument was that Netanyahu poses this huge danger to the nature of the Israeli state, partly for some of the reasons that you said. I mean, the Israelis talk all the time about demographic change and how it's altering the society and making it less liberal isn't even the word. I mean, less modern, less secular, which is how it was founded as a secular state, and it is less and less that. And the ministers who you have just named are the ones who are the most objectionable and who people are the most upset about. So I don't disagree with that at all. I mean, I think Israel is very much at risk of heading in that direction. I mean, not just at risk. I mean, it's already there. The risk is happening, and that's one of the reasons. I mean, Israel is one of those. I don't think the situation in the Middle East fits into the paradigm of my book. I mean, you can see how the contest of ideas is playing out there, but it's a more complicated, nuanced story. It's not like there's good guys versus bad guys in that same sense there. But yes, Israel is at risk of becoming. It's already in a liberal state in many ways, and it's at risk of not being a democracy. And there are many Israelis who know it.
My worry is because we've talked about various. I think Russia's really bad news, right? I mean, at least you can make the argument for the CCP. They helped take 700 million Chinese out of poverty in the last 35 years. I think Russia's really, really bad news. That's, I think, quite a relatively uncontroversial thing to say. But I think that what's going on right now, particularly among Western liberals, is they are underpricing the extent to which Israel and its conduct is delegitimizing the West and democratic values around the world. I think they really are underpricing it. And yes,
I'm sorry to interrupt you. I don't disagree with you at all.
Yeah,
I mean,
I think it's historic. Actually, what's going on?
I agree. I also think that. I mean, and this is in the book. Actually, I also think that the Russian, Chinese, Iranian, sort of information complex has jumped on that and is pumping it out. I mean, they see this as a huge win for them.
Well, it's objectively a gift to Putin.
And that's, yeah. I mean, I think it's more nuanced. Should be perceived as more nuanced than that. But yes, you're right. I mean, I'm not going to disagree with that analysis.
But do you think within sort of foreign policy circles, because you exist in those circles, do you think that is underpriced? I exist
on the fringes of many circles.
Yeah, well, okay, that's fair. But do you think that? I mean, my view is there are millions, tens of millions, maybe hundreds of millions of people around the world who they're not huge fans of the US, they aren't huge fans of Europe, but you know what? at their best, they like those societies. They consume their culture. They quite like the idea of civil liberties, equality under the law, etc., etc. And it genuinely feels to me that many of those people, millions of those people, they're looking at the content on social media, etc. They look at the likes of Britain, the US, etc., giving a free pass to Israel, and they say, actually, you know what? Maybe all that stuff that comes out of the Kremlin or out of Tehran about how they don't mean a single word of it, actually, you know what? Maybe those people over there are right. Do you buy that?
I mean, I can see how people would think that, but that doesn't mean they're right. I mean,
but do you not think it feels, we're talking about Ukraine. That's a historic moment. This also feels really historic.
So, I mean, is the world that black and white? You know, you say, oh well, if the U.S. sees some purpose in protecting Israel from destruction by Iran, that then means that Russia's right to invade Ukraine. I mean, is it that unnuanced?
No. And I think you could say the US should give Iron Dome, etc. to Israel. Somebody can make that argument, but when you've got this daily barrage of videos and images, people have seen them.
Do you think the US is not trying to stop the war?
It is, but I don't think it's trying as hard as it could do. This is my view, precisely because the foreign policy circles in Washington, etc., are underpricing how much of a blow this is to US prestige.
I didn't think anybody's underpricing it.
Really?
I think everybody's perfectly aware. Yes.
Because it just seems so strange to me. A country of 10 million is a very close ally for historic and, all sorts of reasons. I get that. But it is just such a blow, like I said, to quote-unquote Western values and US prestige. And yet they're still arming them. It just seems very strange to me. And it helps all the people you talk about in this book.
There's no question that that's true. I mean, I agree with you.
Can we end on a more upbeat note?
We can end on an upbeat note.
Yeah. What are the things that one can do or countries should be doing in order to stop particularly things like misinformation or creep away from democratic values?
We talked a little bit about some of it. I mean, here's where I think there is a left-right consensus to be had. In fact, I even have this thing about there's a pact to be made with Greens and people who are interested in climate change as well, because the world's autocracies, notably Russia and Iran and Venezuela, these are also petrostates. They're all of them are, a lot of the money that subsidizes autocratic regimes comes from fossil fuels. And it seems to me we have a joint interest in, first of all, cleaning up our own societies. So, why, I said this already, why do we need offshore tax havens? Why do we need anonymous companies buying property in London? Why can't we, as a group of societies, put an end to those practices? We being America, Europe, Australia, Japan. I mean, you could make it as wide as you want. Why don't we, as a group of societies, think harder about what kind of social media we want, not just the kind that Mark Zuckerberg and Elon Musk invented, but is there an alternative? There's some people experimenting with the Taiwanese think a lot about how we could have online conversations in a way that's more sensible. Why can't we do that? And why, the people who are campaigning for climate change should also be campaigning against the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Russian invasion of Ukraine would perpetuate this, a state that is utterly dependent and utterly wasteful of energy and resources, and will do its best to block whatever green revolution there will be. I mean, it seems to me that there are all kinds of synergies and links that could be made between people who want to stop the rise of Autocracy Inc. and the people who believe in progressive politics in lots of different other ways.
I'm very happy we ended there, Anna. Thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you.